The gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack that echoed through the nearly empty courtroom. But it was the sound of laughter that truly cut through the silence. Cruel, mocking laughter that seemed to strip away whatever dignity Margaret Hayes had left. At 67 years old, standing before Judge Raymond Hollister in her threadbare coat and worn shoes, she felt smaller than she had in decades. Her hands trembled as she clutched the eviction notice that had brought her here, the paper now damp with nervous perspiration. Behind her, the courtroom doors stood closed, separating her from a world that had become increasingly cold and indifferent since her husband's death 2 years ago. She had come here seeking justice, or at least mercy, but what she found instead was a man in black robes who seemed to find her desperation amusing. Margaret had lived in the same modest apartment for 42 years. It was where she'd raised her son, celebrated birthdays, mourned losses, and built a lifetime of memories. But 6 months ago, a real estate development company bought the building, and suddenly her affordable rent tripled. Her Social Security checks barely covered her medications, let alone the new rent demands. She'd tried explaining this to the property management company, had even attempted to negotiate, but they were faceless voices on phone lines, who spoke only in legal terms and deadlines. Judge Hollister leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he shuffled through the papers before him. He was a man in his early 50s, well-fed and comfortable, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about where the next meal might come from. His courtroom had a reputation, though Margaret didn't know this when she arrived. Local lawyers whispered about his impatience with cases involving the poor, his tendency to side with corporations and landlords, his visible disdain for those who came before him without expensive legal representation. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're telling me that in 42 years, you couldn't manage to save enough money to afford a simple rent increase? That you somehow expect this court to interfere with a private business transaction because you failed to plan for your future?" Margaret's voice wavered as she tried to respond. "Your Honor, my husband was sick for 3 years before he passed. The medical bills?" "Spare me the sob story," Hollister interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "I've heard 1,000 variations of the same excuse. You lived beyond your means, made poor financial choices, and now you want special treatment." He chuckled again, shaking his head. "The entitlement of your generation never ceases to amaze me." The court clerk shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes fixed on her computer screen. The young attorney representing the development company maintained a carefully neutral expression, though even he seemed taken aback by the judge's tone. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had survived the Great Recession, her husband's long illness, the loneliness of widowhood. She would not break here, not in front of this man. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment," she said, finding a thread of strength in her voice. "I'm just asking for time. 30 days to find somewhere I can afford to live. The company wants me out in 1 week. I have nowhere to go." Hollister was about to respond when the heavy courtroom doors suddenly swung open. The sound reverberated through the space like thunder, causing everyone to turn. What happened next would be talked about in the county courthouse for years to come. They came in single file at first, then in pairs. Bikers, dozens of them. The distinctive rumble of their motorcycles could be heard idling outside. As they filed into the courtroom, their leather vests adorned with patches and club insignia, they were an intimidating sight. Bearded men with tattooed arms, women with steel in their eyes, all wearing the unmistakable colors of various motorcycle clubs from across the state. But they moved with purpose and unexpected courtesy, quietly filling the gallery benches behind Margaret. Judge Hollister's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by confusion and then a flicker of uncertainty. His hand moved toward his phone, likely contemplating calling security. But the bikers simply sat, arms crossed, watching him with steady gazes. There was no threat in their posture, no violence in their demeanor, just presence, powerful and undeniable. An older man with a gray beard and kind eyes stepped forward from the group. His vest identified him as Pops, and the patches indicated he was a road captain of a veterans motorcycle club. He approached the bar that separated the gallery from the court floor and spoke clearly. Your Honor, we apologize for the interruption. We're here to support Mrs. Hayes. She might not have fancy lawyers, but she's not alone. Margaret turned, her mouth open in shock. She recognized some of the faces now. There was Tommy, who she'd tutored in reading when he was 9 years old and struggling in school. There was Sarah, whose mother Margaret had sat with during chemotherapy treatments, bringing soup and magazines for long afternoons at the cancer center. There was James, the young veteran who she'd helped navigate VA paperwork when he returned from overseas broken and confused. And there were others, so many others, people whose lives she'd touched in small ways over 4 decades of simply being a good neighbor and a kind human being. What is the meaning of this? Hollister demanded, though his voice had lost its earlier arrogance. Pops remained calm. Your Honor, we understand courtroom protocol. We're not here to disrupt proceedings. But we heard about Mrs. Hayes' situation. This woman spent years helping people in our community when no one else would. She fed kids whose parents were working 3 jobs. She taught literacy classes at the community center for free. She sat with dying strangers at the hospital. Because she knew no one should face that alone. Another biker stood, this one younger with scars visible on his arms. She helped me get clean. Your Honor, brought me to meetings every day for 6 months when I didn't have a car. Never asked for anything in return. A woman with silver streaks in her dark hair rose next. She took care of my children when I was escaping domestic violence. Gave us a safe place to stay, no questions asked. One by one, they stood and spoke. Each had a story. Each had been touched by Margaret's quiet generosity, her reflexive kindness, her inability to see suffering without trying to ease it. The courtroom, which had felt so cold and hostile minutes before, now seemed to glow with the warmth of collective memory and gratitude. Judge Hollister sat silent, his face reddening. The smirk was long gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. He cleared his throat several times, shuffling papers that suddenly held no authority. Pops spoke again. We've taken up a collection, Your Honor. We have enough to cover. Mrs. Hayes' rent for 6 months while she finds affordable housing. We're also working with a community advocacy group that specializes in tenant rights. But we wanted to be here today because we thought she should know, we thought everyone should know, that this woman has value, that her life has meant something, that she matters. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret's tears flowed freely now, but they were different tears than the ones she'd been holding back earlier. Through her blurred vision, she saw the attorney for the development company lean forward and whisper to the judge. Hollister nodded slowly, his expression transformed. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued, stripped of its earlier mockery. Mrs. Hayes, I'm going to grant you a 60-day extension on your eviction. That should give you time to work with these advocates to find suitable housing. He paused, seeming to struggle with words. And I apologize for my earlier remarks. They were inappropriate and beneath the dignity of this court. The bikers didn't cheer or celebrate. They simply nodded, their message delivered. As Margaret turned to face them, overwhelmed and grateful, Pop stepped forward and gently took her hand. You were there for us, Mrs. Hayes. Now we're here for you. That's how it works. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the community like wildfire. The local newspaper ran a feature about Margaret and the bikers who came to her defense. Donations poured in, not just from the motorcycle clubs, but from people throughout the county who were moved by the tale of ordinary kindness being repaid. The development company, facing unexpected public scrutiny and pressure, eventually agreed to maintain several units in the building at affordable rates for long-term residents. Margaret stayed in her apartment, the one she'd called home for 42 years. But more than that, she remained at the center of a community that had finally recognized what she'd quietly been all along, its heart. The bikers became regular visitors, stopping by for coffee, helping with repairs, ensuring she never felt alone or forgotten. Judge Hollister, for his part, became noticeably different in his courtroom. He began taking more time with each case, listening more carefully to the stories behind the legal documents. Some said he'd been humbled. Others said he'd been reminded of something he'd forgotten along the way. But perhaps the most profound change was in the people who heard the story. It served as a reminder that kindness is never wasted, that the smallest acts of humanity create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. and that dignity and worth aren't determined by bank accounts or property ownership. Margaret Hayes had spent a lifetime planting seeds of compassion, never expecting a harvest. When she needed it most, that harvest came roaring into a courtroom on motorcycles, leather-clad and fierce, to remind a laughing judge in an indifferent world that some debts are paid in loyalty, some wealth is measured in relationships, and true justice sometimes arrives on two wheels with the thunder of engines, announcing that nobody stands alone who has loved their neighbor well.